What's up, guys? My name's Mike. This is All Things Fish, and thanks for tuning in. Today I decided to revisit an old series that I once started called Let's Talk. Now, the series was intended to focus on going back to old live streams, pulling out certain bits that I feel could be particularly useful without you having to sort through the entire live stream trying to find the information that you want. In this stream, I talk with Priscilla from NilocG Aquatics, and we discuss how you can properly supplement nutrients to your plants. The stream wasn't designed to get into the nitty-gritty details and every little specific thing regarding nutrients and fertilizers, but more so to give you an overview and some insight into how you can properly supplement the required nutrients that your plants need and enhance their growth, plus see better success. Take a few minutes, tune in, drop a comment below, let me know what you think.
So let's talk about fertilizers. So a lot of people want to get into planted tanks, and it's easy to buy live plants, and there are some live plants that you can put in just about any aquarium, and they'll do fine just because they're not very nutrient demanding. And some of these include like your Java ferns, your Anubias, your Java moss. They're all they're your slow growers that they're not really worried about parameters. Water hardness, softness, CO2 doesn't really make a big difference to them, at least in a sense that it's not required. So even those easy to grow plants require certain nutrients though, and those nutrients are delivered through more or less your fish waste and the food that you deliver to your tank. So the main nutrients that we're going to consider are micronutrients. Now our micronutrients are going to be our N, P, and K are the big ones, and that's what the estimated index fertilizer dosing method that we'll talk about in a little bit is based on. It's NPK. So your nitrogen, and nitrogen can be utilized by plants in the form of ammonia, ammonium, nitrates. The nitrates are kind of the big one that we tend to think about. Often when people say I have a nitrate problem in my tank where I'm struggling to get my nitrates down, a lot of people say, well, add live plants or add something like pothos, which is like a viney type plant that you can place in like your hang-on back filter, etc., that grows outside the tank, and it sucks those nitrates up out of the water. So that's the N. So nitrates are a big one. That's where nitrogen, okay? Nitrogen is part of the nitrates, NO3, so it's one nitrogen grouped up with 3 oxygen. You end up with a nitrate, and that's kind of the most common nitrogen source that we see for plants in our fish tank. The other one is P, so phosphorus. So we're going to get that from phosphates. Now, some foods are a little bit higher in phosphates than others. Seems to be that your flake foods, for whatever reason, based on the formula that they use, tend to give off a lot of phosphates. So those pass not only through your fish, but as the food breaks down in your tank. So your plants are going to feed off the phosphate to get that further. They'll break it down. They want the phosphorus out of there. Last one out of your NPK is going to be potassium. So your K, potassium. You'll hear if you watch like Bentley Pascoe's stream, he talks about Java ferns a lot. He talks about Java ferns having this desire to consume a lot of potassium, or you may see some lackluster growth. So potassium is going to be the third leg of your NPK. So nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are kind of your big 3. And then you have, all right, sorry, nope, sorry, yep, I misspoke. I see that Ian asked about macro versus micro. Yep, so those are your macros, I apologize. So your macros are kind of your big 3, and those are the nutrients that your plants generally consume in larger amounts. So your nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Now, things that your plants are going to consume in smaller amounts will be your micronutrients. This is things like iron, magnesium, copper, zinc, molybdenum, which is a pretty goofy word, but it's things that your plants need for growth, but you don't necessarily, they don't consume them in large amounts. So some of these, it's not something that we test for. I said, like, nobody's testing their tank for copper levels or manganese or zinc or boron, but these are some of the the nutrients that are involved in your micro category. So just to recap that, we've got 3 big ones: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and then we've got a bunch of little ones: copper, magnesium, iron, manganese, molybdenum, zinc, boron, and there's a couple others that really are more or less not particularly measurable. So those are the nutrients that we care about. And like I said, with regards to your easier plants, like your anubias, your java ferns, your hornwort, your anacharis, those are generally slow growers that aren't picky and don't require a lot of nutrients. Now, things like your swords, like Amazon swords, are super popular in the hobby. They're easy to grow. They look cool for a little while before they just totally outgrow your tank. But your Amazon swords are going to be a little more nutrient hungry. They're going to be more nutrient demanding. So those things, a lot of people are like, well, you should supplement those because you will see poor growth or slow growth. You should supplement those with root tabs, which a root tab is basically just, there's various options out there, but a root tab is going to take a bunch of those nutrients that we talked about, the micros and macros. You're going to shove it down by the roots because root swords, like crypts and kind of some of the rosettes, tend to be heavier root feeders. So your swords are going to be a little more nutrient demanding. So you will probably want to supplement those with some sort of fertilizer. And then we get into the stem plants. Stem plants are generally, they step it up a little bit more as far as they're faster growing. They're going to demand more nutrients. So you will have to provide more micros and macros to see quality growth out of them. And growth is, I like to think of, so when we think about our tank, a planted tank, you've got 3 things that drive and control growth. You're talking about your light. So higher light, your light's kind of like your gas pedal. So your light, if you have high light, you're going full throttle. You're pushing those plants to grow faster. If you look at it, your nutrients are going to be the limiting factor, where the light drives growth, but your nutrients are the limiting factor. So if you have insufficient nutrients, those plants won't be able to grow particularly healthy, particularly fast, because they are limited. They don't have that food source that they need to execute photosynthesis and show growth. And then, of course, we're going to focus on nutrients as fertilizing nutrients that we commonly think about in planted tanks for this stream. However, the primary nutrient that largely goes overlooked in planted tanks is carbon. And the way that we introduce carbon into our tank is through CO2. So a pressurized type CO2 system is the most efficient and most common. But we'll save that for another stream. Just know that carbon is one of, plants are something like 45 to 50% carbon by mass. So think about that. So while CO2 is not necessary, carbon is an essential nutrient along with your NPK plus your micros. So let's talk about dosing the nutrients. We quickly touched base on what nutrients we really care about in our planted tank. Let's talk about how we get them there. There's a couple different methods. So a lot of people, and it's popular with people on a budget or people that want to try something a little bit, out of the ordinary. There's a lot of substrates out there. And one substrate that people choose to use is aqua soil, which is great. And generally speaking, aqua soil, it's a pelletized, often it's kind of a clay-based soil. It's pelletized. It holds a lot of the nutrients that we care about. So the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, etc. A lot of people choose to go with like a loose organic potting soil type mix capped with sand or gravel. And that holds a lot of those nutrients. So while we're not fertilizing the tank, we are putting nutrients in a nutrient-rich substrate in the tank for those plants to feed on. Some people, obviously, over time, the plants will consume the nutrients in that substrate. So people use some sort of root tab. There's various options out there to replenish some of the nutrients in that substrate. And some of the options include, so Colin offers, he has the Thrive root tabs, which I'll bring up here.
Which I got right here.
Oh, perfect. So you've got some, and it's basically, it's a dissolving gel cap with more or less like an estimative index-based mixture in there.
Let me show you those. They're actually pretty big, and you get 50 for about $15.
Oops, not me.
You broke it.
I'm pretty good at that.
See, they're fairly large.
Yeah. So and in those, you'll just, like I said, it's a fertilizer tab that just slides right down into the substrate, and as that gel cap dissolves, it'll release, nutrients such as, nitrogen, phosphate, magnesium, sulfur, boron, cobalt, copper, iron, manganese, etc. So this is how some people will supplement some of their root feeders, like your heavier root feeders, like your swords and crypts. That's how they'll supplement those. Oh, that's awesome. Let's blow that up for a second so you can see that.
Dry fertilizer. So technically, you could just pop it open and dump it in your tank too.
Right. So that's one way. Another option that I see a lot of people talk about is like Osmocote tabs. And Osmocote's all right. You can use like again, it's a gel cap. You can go to like a garden center and get Osmocote fairly cheap. However, Osmocote generally releases ammonium, which is a great nitrogen source for your plants. However, it can potentially turn your tank into a little bit of an ammonia bomb if you put those Osmocote tabs down in the substrate and they float up and dissolve into the water column. You're releasing all that into the water column, which could potentially lead to an ammonia spike in your tank and potentially problematic for your fish. Patty's making fun of the root tabs. They look like her suppositories. Well, how about that? Don't mix those up. You might.
Hey, earlier you were talking about pothos, and I use pothos a lot. I just pulled that out of one of my tanks, and I pulled that out of one of my tanks that has 0 nitrates because of the pothos.
Okay.
That's only half of it I pulled out, but I'm gonna put it back before it dries up.
All right. So I saw a couple comments here in the chat. Fishimon, ATF sure can chat. Yeah, I mean, this is something that I enjoy, and I enjoy talking to people a little bit about it and trying to help you guys out. Kira asked if I'm doing the dirted tank method. You probably won't have to add so much fertilizer if so. Now, I've set up tanks that use like a loose dirt or a potting soil capped with sand or gravel before. I personally, while they can be successful, they can also be extremely problematic because they do introduce a bunch of nutrients into your tank right away. And if you don't have a tight cap over that soil, those nutrients can escape your substrate and release into the water column where you have no control over them. And you could definitely have various algae outbreaks and problems, etc. I also find loose soil tanks to be a little bit harder to work with and messy. Every time, if you want to pull up, crypts and swords will go great in it. However, they are heavy rooters. And when you have, 30, 40, 50 crypts that are all knotted together and you try to pull them out of a loose dirted substrate like that, you're going to end up with a mess. Something like an aqua soil, which I saw somebody ask about before, which is, your Amazonia, your Landon, your it's like your UNS Contra soil Tropica makes one that pelletized soil clay mix that's going to hold a lot of nutrients and be much easier to work with. So I'm skimming real quick. We talked about the main nutrients that we're concerned about. We talked about root tabs a little bit. So let's see before we move on. So Ian asked, he's got dry ferts. Is there a way he can make these root tabs? I would say yes, you could. You'd probably need, I would guess, a gram scale to measure out the different proportions of nutrients that you wanted to fit, again, in just the gel caps, and that would be easy enough to make those, I think. So definitely an option, not something that I've personally done. I just toss Colin some cash
They're so inexpensive. Like I said, it's 50. You get 50 of them for about $15. Do you really want to take that time to make all of those? Because you're probably gonna pay close to the same for just the dry fruits.
I mean, my time's worth something to me. So, if you see anything, I know you're working on a drawing over there. What are you drawing, by the way?
A shark.
A shark.
Somebody put me up to draw a shark. More of a sketch type of situation. I'll show it up later.
So Ian asked, are root tabs needed for heavy root feeding plants, but in aqua soil, since those soils use the liquid first we pump in, if that's correct? So to an extent, I will only use root tabs for a few specific plants that I think might benefit from them, like some certain crypts, some certain swords, etc. Those aqua soils do have an advantage over an aqua soil versus, like gravel, is that aqua soil can absorb nutrients out of the water column that gravel cannot. So that used to be referred to as your cation exchange capacity. There's some other details to it that most people don't need to worry about. But yes, the aqua soil will absorb, your liquid or your dry fertilizers that you add to the water column. So are root tabs needed? Not necessarily. You may see, with some plants I see an improvement. Others, not necessarily so much.
Do you remember I set up the crypt tank? Yeah, so one type of those crypts actually melted on me. And I'm just waiting for the soil that I use, because I used Shrimp King active soil, to leach out all the nutrients before I actually add the root tabs to the tank.
So Jess asked an interesting question. Is there a pet safe alternative to pothos that we could use? She knows her cats will try to eat it and then try to give it to the dogs. So I don't personally put pothos in my tanks. I've seen people do pothos. I've seen people do sweet potatoes. I don't have a ton of experience with it. Obviously, it's exporting nutrients. The sweet potatoes will grow, and it's absorbing some nutrients. How many, I don't know. I did see an interesting, speaking of pothos and nutrient export though, Tom from TM Aquatics kind of had an interesting experience where he had 2 tanks of leopard frog pleco fry, so L134s. One tank had pothos, one did not, and he lost the water parameters were identical, but he kept losing batches of fry from the tank with the pothos. So I'm not sure if that pothos leaches something that's potentially dangerous for the leopard frog plecostomus or not. Do you have any experience with sweet potatoes in tanks, or do you have any other ideas for plants that you could use other than pothos?
No, but I use pothos in a lot of tanks, and I even use it with Caridina shrimp and cuttings and whatnot, and I don't lose shrimp in those tanks. And I mean, I have one with wild gladiator bettas, and I never do a water change on that tank because I have the pothos in there. Yeah, I can go test it whenever it's at nitrates are at 0.
Okay.
And you can use other things, any viney plants when it comes down to it. You can just water propagate it, like evergreen, elephant ear, or even peace lilies.
Yeah. So John mentioned bamboo, monsteras, sands. I don't know what sansevieria is. You terrestrial plant people, whatever. Zen Ginger said her cats have messed with her pothos, but hasn't seen any, detrimental side effects to her cats.
Yeah, they have to eat a lot of it in order to be like dead.
Okay. All right. So I'm just skimming real quick. I'm not hitting everything that's in the chat. We hit root tabs. We hit the big nutrients. We hit root tabs. I'm going to move on to the next fertilizer method here quick, and then we'll touch on some of these questions when I kind of round things up to the end. So we talked about the nutrients. So your NPK, your nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. We talked about the micros, so your iron, magnesium, manganese, cobalt, copper, etc. We talked about how you might use a substrate to offer those nutrients to your plants. We talked about how we can supplement that substrate with root tabs. There's a few options out there, and that's you do videos on end about root tabs. But we often, root tabs are easy and they work well, but plants not only consume nutrients from their root system, but they can also consume plants from the actual leaf structures themselves. So we often will dose the water column. Now, something that we can do to dose the water column, I think probably the most familiar product that everybody has seen is like the CChem line, so their Flourish line, which you can get it just about anywhere. However, there are much better alternatives out there. The CChem line is several different bottles with, largely, to be honest, diluted solutions that aren't really offering a ton to your tank. So one of the liquids that I like to use better is Thrive by Cullen. And like I said before, Thrive is an all-in-one type fertilizer that comes in various formulas based on your needs. And as we can see here, Thrive is going to offer, both your micros and your macros. So nitrogen, phosphate, magnesium, calcium, sulfur, boron, copper, manganese, some iron, molybdenum, zinc. So this is, Thrive. A lot. It seems like more people on YouTube are familiar with Easy Green, which is offered by Aquarium Co-op, of course. But Thrive is it's a little bit more. If you look at the breakdown, it's a little bit more of a complete fertilizer, and it's a little more concentrated. So that's why I prefer it. So this is an all-in-one fertilizer that a lot of people, if they do a weekly water change, they'll dose. You can dose it once a week, twice a week, but you basically dose based on your plant load and your tank itself and how well your tank is or isn't growing. And that's fine. I think a lot of people like to just pump a bunch of nutrients in their tank once a week, and that makes it a little bit easier to not forget about it. However, you are doing exactly that. You're putting a bunch of nutrients in your tank all at once, which you're not limiting your plant's nutrient supply at all, because you're obviously putting a ton in there, enough for about a week. But that also means that the algae has access to whatever nutrients are free floating in the water that your plants can't consume quick enough. So I personally suggest dosing several times a week in smaller amounts versus just once a week. But like I said, Thrive, similar to Easy Green, it's an all-in-one fertilizer, both your micros and your macros, all at once. It's just a couple squirts in the tank based on your tank size, and it works super well. Thrive is probably, within the planted tank community itself, Thrive is probably one of the most well-known and most respected all-in-one liquid fertilizers. There are some other brands out there that offer liquid fertilizers that are not all-in-ones, that may just dose like your potassium or your iron. If you look at like Tropica's line, they've got like their Bright K, and then they have various other supplements to that. Obviously, I mentioned Flourish and Aquavitro are both produced by CChem. They generally tend to offer nutrients in separate bottles, so you kind of have to buy the whole chain of things, which allows you some customization, because you can tweak what you want more or less of. However, it's for what you're getting. Like the Flourish line is extremely expensive, and then you get 3, 4, 5 bottles laying around versus one bottle of Thrive. So that's an option there. And if you look at there's other options out there. Honestly, Thrive is my favorite and seems to be one of the favorites amongst the kind of the higher end planted tank type community.
I use the shrimp one because it's low on nitrogen.
Okay. And so I haven't used it yet, but he also offers, I believe it's the Thrive C, which is, so Thrive is kind of the generic all-in-one. He offers the Thrive Plus, which is kind of for the higher, the faster growing plant that probably our planet tank that probably has CO2 on it. And then he offers Thrive C, which is a little bit lower dosing liquid fertilizer. And he also says it contains a non-glute based bioavailable carbon source. So I'm not sure of the exact details on this. I believe this is kind of one of his newer products. Like I said, I haven't had the opportunity to use yet, but it says it does provide some carbon to your plants. So I'm not sure if that's like a citric acid base maybe, but it is not glute. And again, we're focused on more or less the micros and macros tonight, talking about it. We'll get into carbon and different stream and CO2. I know there's a lot of questions on it, but right now it's just CO2 and carbon itself is just such a huge topic, and we only have so much time. So what are your experiences? What liquid fertilizers do you have experience with, and which ones do you prefer?
I probably used every fertilizer on the market, from like Easy Green to Dustin's Grow Choose to Seekim's Flourish. Yeah, basically everything. But I ended up with Seekim's Aqua Vitro fertilizer because it is much more concentrated. It's basically the same as their regular line of fertilizers, but it's just like 4 times as concentrated. And then I found out about NilocG, and yeah, then I started using his stuff just because it seems to be that guaranteed just that breakdown you get with him you don't get with other fertilizers.
Mm-hmm.
And it just basically says what's in there, the guaranteed analysis.
Okay.
And it's been good for me because I mean I keep mostly mosses and slow growing stuff, so I'm not using
and
that
like
much
Ian
fertilizer.
mentioned before, you do as the water column depending on your substrate. If you do have more or less an active substrate, so like your aqua soils or your Amazonia, your Trapa, your whatever, that do have that cation exchange capacity or the ability to absorb nutrients out of the water column, any nutrients that are not used by your plants directly from the water column will absorb into that substrate for later use, which is extremely beneficial, quick on substrate and nutrients. You can have a successful planted tank that does look beautiful with most substrates that are available. However, set yourself up for success, and substrate's not necessarily a place to skimp out on. You can grow plants in gravel, but you wouldn't try to grow a garden in gravel. So just understand that there are some things you need to consider when choosing those types. There were some people plants asking earlier, when should you dose your tank? I've honestly never seen a difference whether I dose lights on, lights off, before the lights, after the lights. I generally dose in the morning when I get up for work, before the lights turn on, just because that's my routine that I use. There are some things like particularly iron, that if you're dosing iron tends to break down fairly quick with light. So food for thought. Has anybody actually measured it to see how much iron breaks down in the tank before the plants get to it? I don't think so. Generally speaking, most of your all-in-ones, just like Thrive or APT Complete, is going to have more than enough iron in it that you won't really have to worry about it. I know. So iron's one of those nutrients that can get bound up. It can break down with light, or it can get bound up to some of the other nutrients. I believe it's phosphates in particular have an affinity to kind of bind up iron and not let your plants use it. So we'll get into that a little more when we talk dry dosing. But I believe that is why Aquarium Co-op has they have their Easy Green, and then they offer a separate iron supplement, because the specific iron that they use in their Easy Green solution, so there's different forms of chemicals, right? The iron that they use in their Easy Green solution would just get bound up by the phosphate that they have in there.
But you need chelated iron, right?
Right. So Colin uses a different variant of iron that allows it to be in with so the micros and macros can both be together. That's kind of one of the small reasons that I prefer Thrive, is because I get sufficient iron without having to buy an extra bottle. Tail asked about liquid ferts. When next or how long would you do a water change? Depends. I personally, something like Thrive, which is an all-in-one, is kind of based loosely on the estimative index method. And the estimative index method is basically a dosing regime that you're making sure that no single nutrient is ever a limiting factor. And that's kind of a theory that was pushed, well, not necessarily developed, but introduced to the hobby by Tom Barr, based on more or less was it Liebig's law of minimums, where no single element is kind of the lim fact for plant growth. So the estimative index basically has you put a little more of each nutrient in your tank than any plants will use, and then you do a water change at the end of the week to reset it. So my personal water change schedule, even if I was dosing liquid ferts, would be once a week. So Dave from Dave's Aquarium Thoughts did bring up a good point. He mentioned autodosers, which we're talking about liquid ferts. So a autodoser basically, it's generally a small series of peristaltic pumps that you have a fertilizer solution, and that pump is on a timer to deliver X amount of that solution into your tank at set times. Autodosers are great for consistency, and that allows you, like I said before, I'm not a fan of dosing, just a large volume of nutrients at the beginning of the week and then letting them burn out throughout the week. I like to dose smaller nutrients at a time. Autodosers allow you to do exactly that. So autodosers, you can get them pretty cheap. I think the Jebao, Jebao, you can get like a 4 peristaltic pump autodoser for like $60 or something. So definitely Jebo, whatever.
Yeah.
Definitely a good option, like I said, for consistency. Consistency is key with nutrients and dosing. That's why, like I said at the very beginning, pick a regime that allows you to be consistent. Otherwise, you could potentially definitely run into problems. Ian asked about dosing at peak photosynthesis. Can you explain that? So I haven't, I'll be honest, Ian, I haven't read into that particular idea a ton. So that's some reading for me to do. However, my 2 thoughts on that is that if you dose at peak photosynthesis, I like to have the nutrients available ahead of time before the plants start consuming them. So I again try not to overthink it. I've been playing this game for 15 years. I've tried a few different things, trying to make the nutrients available to your plants. I don't know that you're going to see too much of a difference based on what time of day you dose it. And that's like I said, carbon's a nutrient. We dose carbon through the use of injecting CO2 into the water column. A lot of people, they don't wait to hit their target CO2 levels in the tank until peak photosynthesis. They want to hit the target CO2 levels before the lights turn on. So that's kind of, my theory a little bit on nutrients themselves, is make them available before Anthony the asked, if you already have a watered down liquid fertilizer, can you double dose or will you likely run into problems? I would say, yes, you can double dose, and you'll see that, especially with the weaker liquid type fertilizers. They deliver a very small amount of nutrients, whether it's like a Flourish Comprehensive that delivers several nutrients in a small amount, or whatnot. So as your tank grows and as you have more biomass, more plant mass in your tank, it's going to require more nutrients. So you may find over time that the same amount that you were dosing is now insufficient. You're seeing stunted growth. You might be seeing potentially some deficiencies. So you will have to increase the amount of that fertilizer that you are dosing. So yes, you could double dose. You could, experiment with it, see where the sweet spot is.
I mean, plants are pretty good in telling you if something's wrong, if they don't have enough nutrients or too much light, not enough light.
Mm-hmm. Justin Powers asked, any tips on battling hair algae in a planted tank, but also keeping the plants happy with light? I find it hard to find a good balance. So my 2 cents on this, and it may not be the way that everybody thinks, is that generally speaking, healthy plants will outcompete any algae for nutrients. So if you have a good amount of plant mass and you're satisfying those plants' needs through light and nutrients, they'll outcompete the algae, and you won't run into an algae problem. Eventually, the algae will just slowly disappear. A lot of people are like, oh, well, you need to cut back on your light. And that may be the case. If you're running like a 16-hour light cycle and you got your light just burning the tank, could be a problem. Cut it back, because realistically, the plants can't photosynthesize just because the light's on, just because the plant has lights. Like, even though the sun may be out for 14 hours a day, the plants aren't executing photosynthesis. They have to take a break at some point in time. So about 8 to 10 hours is kind of the ideal photo period. So maybe not cutting back on your light may help, may not be the answer though. A lot of people say to reduce nutrients. Well, a lot of algae problems are often caused by not necessarily excess nutrients, but deficiencies of nutrients. So you may find, well, my phosphates are low, so I'm getting green spot algae. So you may want to increase your dosing. So there is a balance to it. For battling hair algae, I would say I like to spot treat with peroxide. So manually remove what you can. Maybe use a syringe or a turkey baster to hit some of the hot spots with the peroxide. That should kill off the hair algae with minimal side effects to the plants themselves. And then, like I said, add plant mass if you need to. If you don't have a ton of plants in there, add more plants. Like I said, they'll outcompete that algae. Should lights on or off? Yep, touched on that one. Personally, I dose before the lights come on. Doesn't matter. Everybody's got their opinion. I don't think anybody's going to take the time to do the testing to tell you, to be honest.
Do you have your lights and a timer?
I do. Like I said, so as with any fish tank, whether it's a reef or planted or whatever, keeping shrimp, etc., consistency is key. So inconsistent light cycles can definitely cause algae. Inconsistent CO2 levels can definitely cause algae. We'll move on to dry ferts here quick. I think I touched on, sufficient questions about liquid ferts there quick. So dry fertilizers. So your liquid fertilizers, like your all-in-ones, whatever is in there is what you're dosing. There's not really any adjustability to it. However, I do like Colin's product, Thrive, the line of Thrive products, because he does offer several variations, different formulas that have different nutrient contents in each one, which is a great benefit, because you may have CO2 in your tank and highlight, so you're driving your plants to grow faster. You may need the Thrive Plus because you want some extra nutrients. On the other hand, you may have shrimp in your tank, so you want the Thrive S that reduces the nitrogen in the tank a little bit. And that's a drawback to, like, if you look at like Forest Comprehensive, APT Complete, Easy Green is you're stuck with kind of whatever ratio that solution is dosing. So what we can do though is we can dose dry fertilizers. Sorry. So that's going to be you'll generally dose your micros and macros separate. So your NPK one day, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium one day, and then your iron, copper, zinc, cobalt, etc. a different way. And that's what Colin offers here. He offers all these things in a couple different types of packs. This is the one that I use. Super cheap, $16 gets you the estimated index-based NPK plus CSM plus B. CSM plus B is going to be your things like iron, copper, magnesium, molybdenum, etc. And these are just dry salts that you literally, like on my 125, I dose half a teaspoon of each in my tank once a day. So I'll do the NPK one day, the CSM plus B the next. And with that, like I mentioned before, that keeps your micros and macros from reacting with each other more or less. So it is a little bit more work because you are dosing separately and you actually have to measure out the salts. However, you do have the benefit of customizability. If your tank needs extra potassium, you just add a little bit more of the potassium, and that's found in both the KNO3, so your potassium nitrate, and your KH2PO4.
I'm too lazy to use the dry ferts. I got too many tanks.
Sorry about that. So you do have the option of customizability because you are mixing the fertilizers yourself. And for 16 bucks, $16. So one of these packs, like I have shown here from Colin, 16 bucks will dose my 125 gallon high-tech highlight CO2 injected tank for, you know, a year and a half, 2 years plus. I still have some fertilizers that I bought from Cullen several years ago. They go a lot farther. They don't go bad. It's a great budget option, and it gives you, like I said, the option of tweaking. So maybe you're using tap water. Your tap water has high nitrates, so you may not need to dose the recommended nitrates, which is definitely, you know, as opposed to like if you're using something like Easy Green, whatever nitrate is in the solution is what you're getting. So you may have a lot more than you need. And you can actually, so here you can kind of see how the estimative index breaks down. Like I said, you're going to do your macros one day. So your CSM plus B, that's your trace elements one day. And you'll alternate every other day with your macros. So my personal setup is I do a water change on Sunday. I dose my macros Monday, micros Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, etc. So I'll dose for 6 days. And then Saturday, I do not dose the tank at all. I let it consume whatever nutrients are left in the water column. Sunday, with the estimative index, you'll generally do a 50% water change and reset your parameters.
Yeah, but for example, I can't do 50% water changes in my shrimp tanks.
Right.
So I usually dose 3 times a week, not the full dose, half of the recommended dose, basically. And then at the end of the week, I do a 10% water change. So you just have to find out what works best for you.
Right, definitely. And that's where, so this is the estimative index, which is probably the most popular form of dosing dry salts. PPS, so precision something or other dosing, is a method. I don't know if he has a chart in here for that or not. But anyway, it's the PPS method. Basically, you're testing the water and you're dosing. So the estimative index, like I said, you're dosing enough that no nutrient is ever the limiting factor. So there's never a deficiency of any nutrient. You always have a little bit more in the tank than any of the plants I use. So PPS is a little bit different in the fact that you're testing the water, you know, pretty regularly, and you're dosing enough so that the plants consume all of it in a day, more or less. So you're not going to have those extra nutrients in the water column. So it's a bit more labor intensive. You do have to do more testing. You do have to do more tweaking. However, like you said, if you're running a shrimp tank and you need to be a little more precise with your water parameters, you are able to do so using the PPS system.
Did you know there's a way you can actually get that stuff tested? Like, you could technically send one of your water samples to icpanalysis.com. I think you can buy like a kit and you get like 5 tubes. You can send them like samples and they will send you a broken down analysis of what's in your tank.
So that's something to consider. So Danny asked, he said, I don't really use fertilizers. How do you know when to dose? Like, how do you know your plants need more fertilizers? Is it all in the leaves with the colorations? What do you think, Priscilla?
So if your plants don't grow, then obviously they don't have enough juice to grow. If they start turning yellow, then it's usually like a magnesium, calcium deficiency. It's kind of like your house plant, too. I mean, I don't know how many of us here actually keep house plants, and you react based on how your plants look.
So Ian asked, he said, you just toss it in dry. I thought we had to mix it in RODI water. So myself, personally, I just toss it into the filter output of my tank. In the past, I've mixed it with tank water. So I'll set out, I'll get 6 little Tupperware containers, label them for each day, and then I'll pre-mix the solutions. Then you just dump the mixed solution into the tank that day. I honestly can't say that I've noticed a difference pre-mixing, like you mentioned, with RODI, or tossing it straight into the tank. Whatever you prefer, whatever works for you.
You use RODI, right, on your tanks?
So my 125, I do use RODI, and that's something to be noted because I use the estimated index method and I dry dose the salts because it's cost effective and it allows me to tweak what's going into my tank. I use RO for multiple reasons because I get a fresh slate. So I get a clean slate. I know there's nothing in the water that I don't want to be there. I know the exact levels of what I'm looking at based on the amounts that I'm dosing. And I know, there's nothing extra from the tap water. One of the concerns with that is, well, what about your water hardness and more or less your stability, which we have an answer for. By dry dosing, we can add GH booster to increase the hardness of our water. Maybe you keep, fish that like a little harder water versus softer water. So that basically just adds a GH booster to your dosing regime. To maybe if you want a little more stability in your pH, etc. If you don't want that that super soft water, you have an option there.
I use shrimp minerals and RO water.
And then, like you said, how do you know when to dose? You can test the levels in your tank. So, API is always potentially inaccurate, but it might give you a close guess as to where you're at. So you can test your nitrogen or your nitrates and phosphates. And if either of those are at 0, then you probably should consider dosing. You can also see it in your plant growth, plant coloration. If a plant, iron is heavily involved in chlorophyll production. So if a plant is deficient in iron, you might not see very good greens out of your plant. Additionally, if you're seeing holes in your plant, whether they're pinholes, etc., you're probably nutrient deficient. Potassium could be a potential option there. So look at your plants. Your plants will tell you a lot of stuff. Are they growing, tall and thin? Are they growing bushy? Do they have good color? Do they have bad color? Do they look the way they're supposed to look? So compare them with plants in photos and on tanks that you see online. Like, hey, my plant looks different. What could be the issue here? And that kind of comes with experience. You just kind of recognize what to look for.
And the same goes for fish. If they act different, something's wrong.
And Crowntail mentioned this to Danny's comment, I believe, that you could be wasting product. You could, but generally speaking, if you're running a planted tank, obviously the more plant mass you have, the more nutrients you're going to need. Test if it makes you feel better. Test and see where you're at and see how your tank reacts. If you dose nutrients and you don't see any improvement at all, no noticeable change in growth, no difference in color, maybe you're okay and maybe you can cut back. It does depend. Bottom Dweller says he uses Easy Green twice a week. Yep, those all-in-ones now. Back in the day, your only option was separate bottles or like dry dosing, dry salts, like an estimated index type method. All-in-ones now make it super easy. Ian said he's learning a lot tonight. Thanks, man. That's good to know. That's what we're here for, trying to help you out. Dan Slee said, guessing you use the NilocG GH booster. What TDS before ferts do you aim for? I actually don't. So I keep fairly soft water type fish. I use straight RODI in my tank for all my water changes. I dose just the EI based NPK CSM plus B without GH booster. So I don't use it. And I have Amazonia in there. It's a couple years old though, so its buffering capability is probably about exhausted. But I keep soft water fish for the most part. So honestly, what TDS do I aim for? Don't really aim for anything, man. It depends. You will see, there are certain plants like your Singonanthus species that prefer softer water. There's also plants that prefer harder water. Like if you look at your Vallisnerias are actually found in like Tanganyika, where they're living in liquid rock, so they appreciate the extra hardness, the extra calcium, etc. For the most part, there are some plants out there that are pretty sensitive to water conditions such as hardness. However, most of them are pretty flexible. So Danny said, if I'm having an algae problem, doesn't that mean too many nutrients? Not necessarily. Like I said, I touched on it earlier in the stream. Sometimes algae problems are actually caused by a nutrient deficiency as opposed to a nutrient excess. So if your plants, algae is a much simpler organism than plants are. So they don't have the requirements that plants need to thrive and survive. So whereas, and these are hypothetical, completely made up numbers, if your plant needs 5 parts per million nitrate a day to survive, your algae may only need 1 or 2 parts per million nitrate to get along just fine. So if you have insufficient nitrate, that plant is over here starving. It's not growing. It's not consuming any nutrients out of the water. It can't grow because it doesn't have the fuel. But this algae, this little single cell, super simple organism algae that doesn't need much to survive, can take off. However, once you do fix the nutrient issue and given, good healthy plants, those healthy plants will outcompete algae for nutrients 9 times out of 10. Snap Wrench said he's out. Have a good night. Cheshire Cat, said she ordered a fertilizer from Etsy. It came as dry powder in a bottle. She added the water. She was struggling to grow water less than her 25, and now she's adding it to other tanks. Was using Easy Green, and you'll see that. So there are several good options for liquid fertilizers on the market. However, based on the water that you're using, or your experience level, you may not necessarily see great results using one of them. I know somebody that's used Easy Green, and they tried to switch over to like an estimative index dry salt based system, and they just ran into problems. So that was while I was gone. I now live pretty close to them, so I'm going to help them out because they do want to switch over.
A lot of times it would help too if you test your tap water or whatever water you start with, like Mike said earlier, just so you know what to add on top of that.
Dan Slee mentioned GH doesn't affect pH or buffering. Only KH to go below 7. Must be 0. Talking about organics, ADA was surprising. It can last for years and years. So I got mine used. I bought the tank used, so I'm not sure. I was told it was about 6 months old. I've had it for a couple years now. So I think it's still doing the buffering thing. I don't really test my water in that tank as much as I should. The tank's working right now, so no reason to tinker with it too much. Yep, we touched on that one. Crowntail Half Moon asked, if using commercial dry fertilizer, do you need balanced fertilizer or a specific NPK ratio? Generally speaking, there are some guides out there. If you're performing the estimated index dosing method, that kind of give you a rough starting point. Usually you'll dose about twice as much KNO3 for nitrates as your other compounds. You asked about ratios. There are some theories out there, such as like the Redfield ratio, etc. As far as your nitrogen to phosphorus to potassium, ratio between those three, the relationship. For the average hobbyist, it's fairly irrelevant, to be honest. I mean, that's my 2 cents. You could easily overcomplicate this and shoot yourself chasing numbers, but you can definitely be successful without getting into the nitty-gritty. Deborah Sanders asked, if nitrates are steady between 20 and 40, should you still add ferts? So fertilizers are more than just nitrates, like we talked about. So if you are between 20 and 40, that's a great range to be in. That's kind of my target. Some people like to be lower. Some people are afraid of going higher, but 20 to 40 is a great range. Should you still add ferts? If you are lacking in other areas, definitely. So like I said, not only are we worried about our nitrogen uptake, but things like our phosphorus, potassium, iron, magnesium, cobalt, etc. So yes, you should still potentially add ferts. Don't focus on a single nutrient. And on Dennis Wong's the 2-Hour Aquarist, he does have an interesting article called Nutrient Tunnel Vision. That's a pretty good read that I think would help a lot of folks. So I'll post that in the chat here momentarily if I can find it. Oh.
Sorry, I have a hard time talking when drawing or when doing art.
So I posted that link to Dennis's article about nutrient tunnel vision, and it's just a good read. His stuff. Dennis offers a ton of information while still making it very readable to the practical hobbyist. So Crowntail Half Moon asked, can adding liquid ferts make water green? Wants to make green water for Daphnia. Yeah, definitely. I mean, for green water myself, I generally actually use like, excuse me. So I will blanch like some broccoli and I'll just let it sit in a tank and that releases nutrients and eventually it turns to green water. Pretty,
you said broccoli?
I use broccoli. Yep.
And that works?
Yeah. So there's a million. I'll make a video about green water one of these days. There's a million of them out there. There's a lot of different methods
to get rid of green water, because I think that's most of the time people's issue.
Yeah. So not fertilizer related. It can be caused, by inconsistent CO2, inconsistent light, etc. My favorite method for getting rid of green water, while you can use something like Daphnia in a smaller tank, depends on if you have fish in there or not. But I use a UV sterilizer. It works every time. It's easy. They can be had. Dansley said, UV sterilizer for the win. You bet. I think it's stupid easy. There's some people say, well, I've got green water, and the first people say to do a blackout for like 4 or 5 days. Sure, and then you turn the lights back on, you still have the problem. Or all that green water, that's green water is a free floating algae as opposed to something that sits on hard surfaces. So if all those cells die because they don't have light, you might see an ammonia spike after that. So something you might unwrap that tank after 5 days and your tank may look good. It may look like a pile of crap. So it's anybody's guess. So a micron filter. So what was it, like the Magnum HOT canisters or whatever that you could put the diatomaceous earth in? I've seen people do that before to get rid of green water because it's so fine that it actually picks out the algal cells from the water column. But just I don't know, UV filters. Mike the Aqua over in Hawaii said green water he doesn't mind. Green hair algae is the worst though. Hair algae, I mean, there's so many different types of hair algae that it can be kind of a pain, and it can be tough to diagnose the cause of it, which is why I said, and you'll see this is me, echoing Tom Barr, not word for word, but pretty close. It says, focus on growing your plants, not fighting your algae and everything. We talked about, kind of dosing some different fertilizers, and we touched on a couple different regimes. And my point of this stream wasn't to tell you all there is to know about, every fertilizer option that's out there. It was just to give you guys an idea of what's out there. Hopefully I sparked your curiosity to want to learn more. And if you do want to learn more, feel free to ask questions. Otherwise, there's a lot of good resources out there. Bentley Pasco has some good videos out there. I'm working on some videos right now. Dennis Wong over the 2-Hour Aquarist has some excellent stuff. Again, I'll drop that link to his tunnel vision article again, because there were a couple people that had similar questions that I feel could fall into there. And if not, they definitely you'll pick something up reading the rest of his website. He's got a bunch of stuff out there, and his website is awesome. Because somebody that's never kept plants before can learn a ton from it, but some of the more advanced people can definitely also learn something, and it's a good refresher. A lot of the times I'll go back and I'm like, hey, what was what am I shooting for here? And I'll go back and I'll skim through it and just get some good information there. And again, it's Dennis Wong. He spoke at the AGA convention in Washington, so some of you that may have attended that might have actually met him in person.
Hopefully you found this video useful. I've dropped some comments down below with some links to some potential useful information, to include to Dennis Wong's website, The 2-Hour Aquarist, as well as Colin's website over at NilocG if you're interested in purchasing your nutrients there. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to drop them in the comments below. I'll get to them as soon as I can, or email me, mike.allthingsfish@gmail.com. That'll be it for now. I hope you have a great day. Good luck with your tanks, and we'll see you later.